welcome to this chess video, everyone. So here we will be starting from this position, and this will more or less be kind of our main line for this video. So this is probably the most common setup that you could have. Of course, showing the moves once again. It would be e4 for white, e5 for black, very common, knight f3, and then knight to c6. And this has been played so many times, players all across the rating levels from grandmasters all the way down to beginner, and it is a very solid opening, but now what? Now what are we supposed to do? Okay, so the very first one I want to get into is the Italian game, which will start with bishop to c4. And the reason that I like this opening here, especially for beginners, is because we are trying to get our piece developed, and we are very close to castling. And so with that, we have a very nice bonus that the other opening, this one here, the Spanish or Ruy Lopez opening, does not have. And that bonus, that one detail, because they both develop a bishop, they both get close to castling, but that details that the bishop from here is controlling a little bit of the center and is a little bit more active on the enemy king. Sometimes the f7 square can be actually a weak point, very similar for white. The f2 square can sometimes be a weak point. And so one way to exploit that would be long term, not straight away because, this square is undefended, but maybe if this d-pawn were advanced at some point, this knight might come to g5, might put some pressure on their king, and the same thing could go the other way, of course. If they have their knight here, their bishop here, they might do very similar stuff where this knight might come in and put a lot of pressure on our position. And so these are some extra benefits that the Italian game has. But the main one by far is that these four central squares, the bishop is now controlling one of those squares. And that is very important because opening principles, it's good fundamentals to control the center. And so we're just being very solid and getting all of our pieces very active, and we have a very good game from here. Now, I will just show us a few sample variations how this could continue. So one variation I like is oftentimes after knight f6, we will play pawn d4. And this is the open variation. I like this because it kind of opens up some tactics. We're fighting for the center right away. And it's not as passive as something like, say, d3, which of course is completely playable as well. And so after d4 move here, most often they will probably take this pawn. And this is where it gets fun, because we can just castle, still use opening principles, but we are not down a pawn permanently. They probably do not want to grab this pawn. If they do grab this pawn, although it is a main line and it is playable, black has to be very careful, because rook to e1, and already this knight is pinned, and if they don't know their lines very well, they could get into a lot of trouble. If they do know their lines well as black, they'll get in about equal position. And so with a lot of these main lines, you really have to know your stuff if you want to survive. So the next we have bishop to c5, very common. They just want to develop a piece, probably push this pawn at some point and get developed and, ideally get castled. Very commonly, we'll push pawn to e5. And already this knight is under a lot of pressure. And so really all you have to know here, if you're playing black, is this main move, because most people do not play this and they get into a little bit of trouble. Now, there's nothing wrong with taking this pawn, although it's a bit risky because, again, the rook to e1, and we have that pin along the e-file. There's also nothing wrong with saying knight to g4, putting extra pressure on this pawn, but that is also a little bit risky. Actually, the best way for black to play here, if they know their stuff, is to counterattack in the center with pawn d5. And this is really the best way to continue, but if something like this happens, really, I would say this is kind of a thematic position that Italian game players should be very happy with. And if you even have only this part studied as white, or even black if you choose to play it from that side, I think you'll have an advantage compared to most people who play this opening, because most people don't study this deep. We're already move 6, and that's a lot of opening theory for most people. Now going back to the Italian game here, I just want to show one other variation, but I chose to bring it all the way back to the main line just so these ideas repeat itself and you don't get too lost in which variations go where. And so very common is, again, this move we've already looked at. Our move was pawn to d4, completely fine. And then we had captures. We castled. And I just want to show real briefly if they do take one variation that could happen with the pressure from our pin on the e-file. So maybe one idea could be like rook to e1, and this knight is under a lot of pressure already. But I wanted to show at least more or less their best play, just kind of for completeness of this video. Very similar to what we looked at, black's best try is actually to play pawn d5 and try and secure their knight here as well as attacking the center. And so if white captures this pawn, we have queen captures back. We are actually about equal if white plays this really cool idea, knight to c3. And the reason, of course, is because this knight cannot capture, because, of course, the e4 knight is pinned. We still have the e-file pressure. And the pawn cannot capture, of course, because then we would just take their hanging queen. And so this move just gains an extra tempo on the queen. After their queen gets kicked away, something like this, we can capture here, and now we have a discovered attack on their king. So they'll probably have to break the pin, something like bishop e7, and it's an equal position from here, but I guarantee you a lot of players are going to slip up if they don't know theory. And so that's a big advantage to you if you know a little bit of the main lines for the opening that you choose to play. But now let's bring it back here, and let's touch into the other opening that I mentioned real briefly. And so the Ruy Lopez, sometimes called the Spanish opening, would be bishop to b5 instead of c4. And so this move does not control the center like the other move did, but it's a little bit different, because here you might make an argument that you could capture this knight, and this knight was controlling some of the center. And so you would think that by doing so, we are sort of indirectly fighting for the center. And although that is true at face value, it's not actually my favorite variation here, because white in doing so is giving up their bishop here. They are trading this bishop for this knight, and by doing so, they might have weaknesses on that color complex. I made a few videos on the bishop pair, so if you want to check out some of those, I'll put some of those thumbnails up on the screen, and you can maybe look for those on my channel. So again, I don't really like taking here too much, because very often what's going to happen is they play pawn to a6 at some point, and now you're kind of provoked into taking this knight. And if you take it, well, this is okay, it's playable, but they'll just defend their pawn, and it's just a normal game from here. But I think that the fact that white's given up the bishop pair already is something they maybe shouldn't have done. But now you might be wondering, of course, let's go back. What if we don't take the, knight? What if we instead retreat to a4? And this is more common as the main line, I would say. But at some point, after they develop and we castle, they're probably going to push b5. It's just a matter of time whether it be now or later. And this bishop will have to be kicked back to b3. And they'll probably want to continue developing. If black wants to play an open game, they will play bishop to c5, close the pawn chain, and they have a normal game from there. If they want a more closed position, they're going to play bishop to e7 and then get castled. And in both cases, I think black is okay. So after either bishop c5 or bishop to e7, I think they're in a lot of good positions for both sides, and it really just comes down to which player knows a little bit more opening theory than the other. Now, I kind of like these positions, if that's something you choose to study, but if not, I prefer the Italian game because at the very beginning, we're controlling a little bit more of the center. And I think for someone who just wants to play opening principles, get a solid position, I think this is probably more thematic ideas that they should be studying. But by all means, play any of these openings that you feel comfortable with or are curious to explore. There's another very common main line that white can choose here, and this is playing d4 right away. And so if we advance immediately, this is known as the Scotch game. And this is actually the opening that I started playing when I played e4. When I first started chess, I think everyone kind of knew the 4 knights game, where you just bring out the knights really early, something like this. And although that is a very fine opening in itself, because of the symmetry, it might be a bit drawish, and we're also not trying to get castled as quickly as we could have. So it's probably better to fight for the center immediately with the pawn, or to develop this f1 bishop to try and get castled. But again, nothing wrong with this opening if that's what they so choose play, and it is playable. But with d4, we're just striking the center right away. And I love that. When I was starting out in chess, I thought it was so cool that I could immediately start fighting for the center. And my queen is defending this d-pawn. And although that might sound trivial, at the time, I thought that was the best thing in the world. I thought it was better than sliced bread. And so if they capture here, as mostly happens, we will play knight captures d4. And a lot of beginners will actually make the mistake of just trading their knight and then queen captures d4, and this is fine for white, because although they have their queen brought out a little bit early, black will have nothing developed, and at least white's queen is centralized for the time being. And so sometimes they would kind of give you an advantage if you play this opening, and they didn't know what to do. Now, if they do know what to do, knight f6 is a common developing move, but also I would like to show bishop to c5. Actually, I think that'll be the main line I kind of want to show in this video. Bishop c5, and then of course white has to address the knight, but we don't want to trade, because again, this isn't really the best thing in the world for us. We're getting rid of the tension a bit early, and if we do capture here, we give black some extra options that we don't really want to play. For example, they might capture with the pawn, and now their bishop can get developed if possible. Another idea too is maybe in some lines, if we take here, they'll play queen to f6, and maybe they don't want doubled pawns, they can just recapture because we have to address the threat on our king for checkmate. And so these are all a little bit more advanced ideas for theory that's not entirely important for the purpose of this video, but I just want to kind of mention them briefly for those curious enough that want to explore. More common is going to be bishop to e2, maintaining the tension in the center, and then queen f6 with similar ideas, but adding more pressure to this knight. And we will play something like pawn c3, perhaps knight g to e7, since the knight could no longer go to its ideal f6 square. If you want a video that shows why the knights tend to be better here, and why knights are generally developed before bishops, I have another video that you could check out here. But next, white will continue developing bishop c4, black will probably castle, white will probably castle, and something like this is playable. But from my experience of playing this opening, most people don't get entirely this deep into opening theory, and, you know, that's got good and bad to it. I feel like what ends up happening is this opening tends to be a bit more tactical, and I think the reason I switched was I realized it wasn't really my playstyle. And that's okay. When you play new openings and you're experimenting, you want to see what kind of positions you're comfortable in, and then stick with what you like, because all of these openings I've shown so far are very solid, played by beginner all the way through grandmaster level. And so if you want to take a look at those, by all means, check them out. Now I want to mention a few other opening possibilities that you might very well see. So here, I will mention very briefly, what about the others? Well, we already mentioned knight c3 a little bit, and how that might become the 4 knights game. Nothing wrong with that opening as well, but we are not getting castled as quickly as we perhaps could. Another option you might see a little bit is maybe the Ponziani opening with pawn to c3. And your idea is to try and reinforce striking in the center with d4. And again, very different opening, but as we've looked at, c3 isn't actually even required here, because you could play pawn to d4 and strike in the center immediately. And just like the Scotch game with d4 immediately, the Ponziani can sometimes be very tactical. So those are some other options if you want to explore. Now, other moves don't really, do too much to contest the center, or it's just a little bit outside the scope of this video. For example, if someone just wastes a move, something like, say, a3 or a4, although that might look kind of silly, maybe they can transpose into a decent opening, but at least for the time being, they are not controlling the center, they are not developing a piece, and they are not trying to get castled too quickly. And oftentimes that'll backfire, because opening principles are useful for a reason. You generally want to be controlling the center, developing pieces, and getting castled early. And if you can do those things, you're going to avoid most traps. And for beginners, that is what you really want to do. You just want to get a very playable position, and then memorize the few cases where, you fall into a trap, and then trial and error, you learn from your mistakes. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next chess video.